Before we begin, we need to clear some confusion here, and that confusion is actually caused by Vallejo. If you recall, or if you are not aware, a few months ago Vallejo did a rebranding, and they brought out products or updated products. However, it was unclear if their standard acrylic primer line was one of the new products. Had it been formulated or reformulated differently to be a better primer? I reached out to Vallejo. I did not get a response. I looked on their webpage. There was no information. However, modelers throughout Facebook were posting that this new primer formula was working better. It was definitely a different primer formula, so this had to be a different new primer. I still have not received, and nor do I have any confirmation from the company themselves that this is a new one, but testing, it is definitely different, or it's been formulated, so as such I'm going to consider it a new formula. Before we begin, I want to talk about what kind of testing I'm going to do in this video. In particular, I'm going to do my method of testing, and my method of testing is based on what I need the primer to do for me. I'm a model maker. I need the primer to lay down smooth, to sand easily, and be ready to go in an hour. So Vallejo recommends that you give it at least 24 hours to cure. And my method of testing, I'm trying to find a way to make it work under an hour. So I will not be letting the primer sit for 24 hours. I think that's ridiculous for a primer to cure for 24 hours before it's sandable or usable. So keep that in mind during this testing. First thing, how to tell if you have the old bottle or the new formula bottle. Well, you can tell based on the updated branding. The old bottle is on the left here, and the new bottle is on the right, and you can see the branding includes pictures now and larger lettering. The directions on the back are the same for both bottles. That has not changed. First major difference I noticed from the old primer and the new primer was thickness. The old primer is more liquid and flows more easily, as you can see in this pour test. It moves around the cup fairly freely. The new primer is much thicker and does not flow as well. At first this concerned me, as I figured you would need to increase the air pressure for the new primer. However, Vallejo instructions on both bottles say to airbrush between 15 to 20 psi. The testing began with spraying the old primer directly onto the model unthinned. The test is to see the airbrush quality of the old primer versus the new primer. When airbrushing acrylic primer, you want to start with a light coat to reduce the surface tension. Then build up your layers. When you are happy, you want to come in with a wet coat. This will give you the gloss look. For the old primer, first minute and a half, the old primer airbrush with no clogging or spitting. After the minute and a half, there was some clogging and I had to blow out the clog to the side, but I was able to fully prime the model with no other major issue. Much like the old primer, I first began by spraying the new primer with a light coat to reduce the surface tension. Then I built up the primer until I was happy with the coverage and applied a wet coat at the end to establish a gloss finish. While the new primer is thicker than the old primer, it sprayed much better than the old primer. For the entire test, the new primer did not clog even once. It also seems to level out better directly from the airbrush. While priming, I noticed that there was an orange peel effect with the new primer. However, once the primer was dried, this disappeared. Time for the sanding test. This is the most important test of any primer. If a primer is not sandable and cannot leave a smooth, feathered surface, it should go in the trash. I start the sanding test with the new primer test piece first. My process is to use 400 grit, 600 grit, 1000, 2000, and finally 3000. The goal is to create a smooth, feathered finish for the repriming and for the final paintwork. A smooth finish in your primer surface is extremely important, especially if you plan to do a natural metal finish, which will highlight even the smallest of flaws. One thing to note about gloss primers: the ingredients in gloss primers that make it gloss also make it cure faster and more sandable than normal primers. If this was a regular flat Vallejo primer, I would heavily recommend letting them cure for at least 24 to 48 hours prior to sanding. Both primers seem to sand fairly easy and feel smooth to the touch. This does not mean they are fully smooth. You will need to apply another coat to test if everything is feathered out perfectly. Neither primer gummed up on itself while sanding. This is a big known problem with Vallejo flat primers. The third test is the masking test. Another major issue with Vallejo primers is lifting when masked over. As I mentioned in the last test, the ingredients that make gloss primers gloss make them more resilient. So I did not expect the tape to lift the primers. And as you can see, the tape directly applied over the test pieces and ripped off did not lift the primers at all. I did observe that the old primer still felt a little tacky after 1 hour. However, the new primer was not tacky at all. Time to apply the primers on their respective test pieces. Each primer again was applied directly from the bottle at the same PSI and no thinning, and each test piece was given 1 hour to dry. Results of the sanding and feathering. On the test piece for the old primer, you can see the feathering was okay at best. There is a slight ridge between the previous layer and the new airbrush layer on top. For the new primer, the feathering was better, but not amazing. There is still a step between the previous layer and the new layer, however this step is much less. This is my biggest issue with Vallejo primers. They don't feather out well if you don't wait at least 24 to 48 hours. How do you get around the 24-hour to 48-hour curing time? The way I get around it is by buffing the second coat of primer I applied on top of the first coat of primer after sanding. Start with 1000, then 2000, 3000, and then finish with a polishing stick. This will blend the first coat of primer with the second coat of primer. You should have no step between the two after this. The buffing process will reduce the glossiness of the primer, so once you are finished, you will need to reapply another coat in order to regain that gloss finish. My recommendation on how to properly use the old or the new Vallejo gloss is to use my mix formula. My mix formula helps the primers airbrush better, lay down smoother, make them more resilient to being masked over, and makes the finish more sandable. It also leaves a more glossy finish to the new primer. I recommend thinning the primer 60-40 primer to my mix formula and using low PSI. A common question from modelers is how many layers of primer should they airbrush onto their model. As you can see here, I don't have a set number of layers I airbrush. I go until I'm happy and I can no longer see the styrene plastic color underneath. As I mentioned earlier in this video, the new primer formula seems to be very thick. Here you can see as I pour it into my airbrush cup, it is having a difficult time going down the strainer. I had to use a stirring stick to help it go down from the strainer into my airbrush cup. The old formula did not have this problem. It went down into the cup through the strainer almost as if it was water. I can say with confidence that once everything was ready to go, the new formula mixed with my thinner mix airbrushed much better than without my thinner mix. It laid down smooth, it flowed better, and it was just more of a pleasure to airbrush than without my thinner mixture. When you compare the test pieces that have used my mix formula with the gloss black primers, old or new primers, you find that they have a much nicer finish. The finish is smoother and it's got a darker, richer, glossier tone to them. This is perfect for a natural metal finish for your model. One of the main reasons I recommend using my thinner mixture with Vallejo primers is that it makes the primers sand and feather out better. In the previous sanding test, the primers did feather out decently, but here you can see the primers are feathering out much better. This is really important for when I come back in to reprime the sanded area, everything will blend in without me having to buff the primers like I did previously. There will be no steps, and there will be a smooth finish. Here you can see I'm reapplying the primers with my airbrush. You can see how the primers blend in on both test pieces and leave a perfect finish for natural metal colors to be applied on top. We are finally at the most important test, the paint test. For this test, I'm using lacquer metallic paint. Why lacquer and not Vallejo metal colors? Lacquer metallic paint is very unforgiving. It will highlight the tiniest flaws or faults. Vallejo metal color will also highlight flaws, but not to the same degree, as it is a bit more forgiving than lacquer metallic paint. I airbrushed all the test pieces in the areas that were sanded to see if the primers leave any steps, or was the surface smooth as silk. For the new primer test piece straight from the bottle, I forgot which side of the wing I sanded, as both sides were very smooth, so I had to go back and paint the proper area. Here are the final results of the testing. First up is the test piece with the old gloss primer straight from the bottle. I know it's hard to see on video with the shine from the metallic paint, but the finish is not the best. While it looks okay, there's still an ever so slight step in the area that was sanded and buffed. It is very hard to see. You would need to be right next to the model to even pick it up. If you applied a camo on top of this primer, it would not be visible at all. But for a natural metal finish, this is not the best finish. Next up is the new primer straight from the bottle test piece. This finish is much better. It is super smooth. There is no step whatsoever in the area sanded. However, there is an orange peel effect where I went heavy-handed on the primer. The primer did not level out as much as I thought it would. This is something to keep in mind. Don't flood the area when priming. Now for the test pieces for both the old and new primer using my mix formula. Hopefully you can see both test pieces have a brighter shine to them. This is the result of using my mix formula, which leaves a glossier black finish to the primers. The only noticeable difference from the old and new bottle using my mix formula is that the old primer was slightly tacky, while the new primer was completely dry to the touch. Here are my conclusions based on my testing. The new primer works better. When used straight from the bottle, it airbrushes better, it levels out nicely, it leaves a nice finish, and it is more sandable than the old primer. The primer has less clogging straight out of the bottle. This is one of the biggest complaints modelers have about Vallejo primers. While Vallejo advertises their primers as being good to go out of the bottle, they do recommend thinning their primers in their YouTube videos for best performance. Do with that as you will. The new primer was much more sandable than the old primer, but still required some buffing to obtain a smooth finish. Remember what I said in the beginning of this video. I am not going to wait 24 hours for the primer to fully cure. One of my modeling requirements for any paint or primer is that it is good to go after 1 hour wait time. The sanding test results would have been better if I had waited the required 24 hours, probably, so this assessment is partially biased. My final conclusion, while the primer is better, it works best if you use my mix formula. My mix formula makes the primers airbrush better, it seems to leave a smooth finish, it is ready to be sanded after only 1 hour, and it seems to leave a glossier finish than without my mix formula. Would I recommend the new Vallejo Gloss Primer? Yes, I would recommend it, and I have already used it on my recent build. If you go to my channel and watch my recent video on the FA8 Bearcat, I used the new primers as my gloss for the natural metal finish, and the finish turned out really nicely. My only two caveats would be, use my mix formula with the primers for the best results. But if you do not want to use my mix formula with the primers, thin the primers with Vallejo airbrush thinner and let them fully dry for 24 hours.